Kenya, 1950. In the cold forests of Aberdare, a wounded man falls to his knees, yet his eyes still burn with fire. "You can kill me," he whispers, "but you cannot kill Kenya's dream." His name was Dedan Kimathi, the rebel who refused to kneel. The story begins in the highlands of central Kenya land, once alive with Kikuyu, songs and stories whispered under sacred fig trees. But by the time Dedan Kimathi was born in 1920, that same land had been stolen. The British Empire had come wrapped in promises of order and civilization. What it brought instead were fences, taxes, and soldiers who spoke of peace while pointing rifles. The fertile soil of Nyeri, where Kikuyu farmers had lived for generations, was seized and renamed White Highlands. Africans who had once owned fields became squatters on their own ancestral ground, working for men who called them boys. Dedan grew up watching the quiet humiliation of his people. He watched his mother cry as British soldiers took the family goat, claiming unpaid taxes. He watched elders bow before district officers who could not even pronounce their names. And in those moments, the boy learned what no school would ever teach: that land is not just soil, it is the soul of a people. He would later write, "When a man is stripped of his land, he is stripped of his heart." Kimathi went to school, one of the rare African children who did and learned to read the Bible, Shakespeare, and the British Constitution that spoke of liberty. The contradiction burned inside him. The empire preached freedom in London, but built prisons in Africa. It quoted scripture about peace, while flogging women in the market square. Each day, he saw the same story repeated: the landless Kikuyu, the starving farmer, the schoolchild beaten for not bowing to a white policeman. And slowly, beneath the quiet rhythms of colonial life, something darker began to move. It was not yet a rebellion. It was a heartbeat. By the 1940s, resentment had spread across central Kenya like dry grass before a spark. The Kikuyu whispered of Uhuru freedom. They met in secret huts and forests, away from the eyes of the British. They remembered the spirits of ancestors who had fought invaders long before the Queen's flag arrived. And among them, Dedan Kimathi began to rise, a man of words, of passion, of dangerous faith. He was not born a soldier. He was born a witness to the slow theft of his people's dignity. But a witness, when pushed too far, becomes a flame. Before he picked up a rifle, Dedan Kimathi carried chalk. He was a teacher, respected, eloquent, often seen walking to class with a Bible under his arm. He taught his students about letters, numbers, and something rarer, pride. He told them that their black skin was not a curse, but a story written by the sun itself. Every evening, he would stay behind after class, reading the scriptures aloud. He loved the verse, "The truth shall make you free." But one day, he saw a British officer slap one of his students for not bowing. Something broke. The next morning, he came to school without his Bible. He walked to the blackboard, stared at the lesson, and then said quietly, "I will not teach submission." He quit that day. Within months, Kimathi joined a secret oath society, what the British would soon call the Mau Mau. But to its members, it was Anake of 40, the sons of the land. They met deep in the forest, swearing loyalty to the soil and to one another. Each ceremony was sacred, blood mixed with earth, vows spoken in whispers: "We shall regain our land, or die upon it." The oath was not just political, it was spiritual. It bound them not only to each other, but to the spirits of ancestors who had walked those forests before. Kimathi's intelligence and fire made him a natural leader. He organized cells, trained fighters, and wrote in code to avoid the colonial police. He began keeping a diary not of victories, but of dreams. In one entry he wrote, "The day we fear the gun more than the chain is the day we lose our freedom twice." Soon, his name was whispered like a legend. The teacher had become the forest's voice. A man who once graded papers now drew battle maps on banana leaves. His classroom had become the Aberdare Hills, his students, men and women, ready to die for Kenya. And in the stillness of those nights, the empire trembled, though it did not yet know why. The forest became their cathedral. At night, under the silver breath of the moon, men and women of the Kikuyu gathered in circles, their faces half lit by fire, half hidden by shadow. There were no priests, no churches, only the whisper of leaves and the scent of blood and soil. Each initiate knelt as a gourd was passed. Inside was a mixture of goat's blood and river water. Each cut their palm and let a few drops fall into the earth, a symbol that their life now belonged to the land itself. It was not superstition. It was faith, raw, old, and older than the empire that ruled them. When it was Dedan Kimathi's turn, he raised his right hand and spoke clearly, "We shall regain our land, or we shall die upon it." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. The Mau Mau oath was both sacred and dangerous. To break it was to invite death not from bullets, but from betrayal. To keep it was to live knowing that every day might be your last. Kimathi wore a leopard's skin across his shoulders, not as decoration, but as a symbol. The leopard was the guardian of the forest, feared and respected. In wearing it, he declared himself the protector of Kenya's dream. From that night, the Kikuyu began to whisper another name for him, the Leopard Man. In the darkness of 1952, war came like thunder. British officers called it an emergency, but to those who fought, it was liberation. Kimathi gathered men from Nyeri, Embu, and Meru farmers, laborers, even former policemen, and molded them into the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. Their weapons were crude, old rifles, homemade grenades, spears carved from tractor parts, but their belief was sharper than any blade. Kimathi led them through baptism by fire, a ritual of courage before the first battle. They stood under rain, barefoot, each man holding a handful of soil. He told them, "This is your mother. Never drop her, never betray her." The night air was heavy with resolve. As they disappeared into the thickets, the forest seemed to breathe with them, an army born not of command, but of conviction. Somewhere far away, in white offices in Nairobi, colonial officials laughed. They called Mau Mau savages, terrorists, a primitive cult. They did not know that history was already sharpening its pen. They did not know that under that same moon, Kenya was reborn. The Aberdare Mountains became both sanctuary and battlefield. From 1952 to 1956, the forest swallowed Kimathi's army and turned them into ghosts of the land. British patrols would march for days and see nothing, only mist, rain, and the whisper of footsteps vanishing into fog. Kimathi's men lived like shadows. They slept beneath ferns, drank from mountain streams, and carved bullet molds out of tree bark. Each sunrise was a risk. Each fire lit at night could mean death. But through hunger and exhaustion, one thing kept them alive: belief. They believed that freedom was worth dying hungry for. Kimathi studied the empire the way a hunter studies prey. He knew the British relied on roads, radios, and air power. So he attacked those very veins, cutting telephone lines, derailing trains, ambushing convoys. His war was not to conquer, but to bleed the empire's pride. Every victory was small, a blown bridge, a seized rifle, yet each one echoed like thunder in the villages. The Kikuyu saw their sons become heroes. And in the cities, British settlers began to feel fear for the first time. They locked their doors at night. They whispered the name Kimathi as if it were a curse. But for Kimathi, it was never about vengeance. He forbade his fighters from killing unarmed civilians. He kept a small notebook tied to his waist, a diary written in careful handwriting, recording not triumphs but questions. In one entry, he wrote, "A man who fights without mercy is no freer than the man who rules with chains." As months turned into years, the war hardened. The British brought in 55,000 soldiers, planes, and police dogs. They called it a hunt, but in truth, it was a purge. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and more than 1 million Kikuyu were herded into detention camps. The smell of smoke lingered over the valleys for years. Still, Kimathi refused to surrender. He moved through the forest barefoot, his Bible tucked beside his pistol. He would read to his fighters before battle, not strategy, but scripture. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." To many, he was a soldier. To others, a prophet. But to the British, he was something far more dangerous. A man who could not be conquered by fear. When they finally called him the most wanted man in Kenya, Kimathi laughed softly and said, "Then they have already lost. Empires do not die quietly." When the British realized that rifles and patrols could not crush a dream, They declared war on the forest itself. In 1953, a state of emergency spread across Kenya like wildfire. 55,000 troops were deployed. Planes circled above Aberdare, dropping bombs into trees so dense that daylight itself seemed to bleed. Villages suspected of helping Mau Mau were burned to ash. Children watched their homes disappear into the smoke, their mothers forced into barbed wire camps the British called protected villages. But behind those fences were hunger, disease, and despair. Every night, the mountains echoed with the sound of boots, dogs, and helicopters. Every morning, the rivers ran muddy with the memory of violence. The Empire called it order. Kimathi called it revenge. Inside the forest, Kimathi's forces grew thinner. Ammunition was scarce, and every spark of a campfire risked betrayal. They scavenged food from raided convoys, foraged berries, and learned to eat the bitter roots of wild plants. Still, he never let his men lose spirit. He would gather them at dusk and speak softly, his words carrying through the mist like prayer. We do not fight because we hate. We fight because we remember. Kimathi's message spread far beyond the forest. In towns and schools, whispers grew louder. The British banned the Kikuyu language in public gatherings, but it could not silence the songs, the hymns of the hills that carried Kimathi's name. Meanwhile, in Nairobi, the British built a propaganda machine. Newspapers painted Mau Mau as bloodthirsty fanatics. They published photos of rebels in chains to calm the white settlers who now lived in fear behind their own fences. But the truth was harder to contain than ink. For every rebel captured, 10 more took an oath. For every body found, another voice rose from the soil. In secret, even some African policemen assigned to hunt the Mau Mau began feeding Kimathi's troops information. Freedom, it seemed, was contagious. Yet, Kimathi knew the tide was turning. The British had learned the terrain, mapped the trails, and built fortified bases near the foothills. Worse, the Empire now recruited Kikuyu loyalists, men who would betray their own for survival. It was a war without front lines, where trust could kill faster than bullets. One night, while the forest shivered under cold rain, Kimathi wrote in his diary, "We are surrounded not by soldiers, but by fear. But fear cannot hold a gun." He still believed that faith, not firepower, would carry them through. But faith alone could not stop betrayal. And betrayal was already moving in the dark, one whisper at a time. In the heart of the Aberdare forest, under a sky veiled by fog, Dedan Kimathi became legend. He wore a leopard skin cloak, not as vanity, but as defiance. To his people, it meant strength, wisdom, and rebirth. To the British, it meant madness, a wild man who thought himself invincible. But in truth, the cloak was armor of the spirit. It reminded his men that the forest itself fought beside them. Kimathi walked barefoot, carrying two things, a pistol and a Bible. Between gunfire and raids, he would gather his fighters around a small fire and read aloud from the Psalms. When he finished, he would close the book and say, "God does not only live in churches, he lives in every tree that hides us." His soldiers adored him not because he promised victory, but because he promised meaning. To die under his command was not to vanish. It was to join the ancestors who guarded the land. One fighter later said, "When he spoke, you forgot hunger, you forgot death. You felt free, even before freedom came." But not everyone shared his conviction. Years of war had taken their toll. The camps, the starvation, the executions all had drained the Kikuyu people. Many began to surrender, seeking safety in colonial amnesty programs. And in those lines of desperate faces, the British found what they could not win by guns informants. They paid hunters to track the leopard man. They offered freedom to prisoners who could reveal his hiding places. The noose was tightening. Still, Kimathi kept moving. He changed camps every few days, carrying his diary wrapped in animal hide. He wrote poetry, prayers, and letters to his wife, Mukami, who was hiding with sympathizers in the plains below. He asked her not for food, but for faith. "Tell our children," he wrote, "that their father walks in chains only to break them for others." By 1956, Kimathi's army had dwindled to a few dozen fighters. Yet, his myth had grown far beyond the trees. Even British soldiers began to wonder aloud if he could be caught at all. He was more than a man, he was a story that refused to die. And stories, the British would soon learn, cannot be shot. Still, fate had begun to turn its gaze. A single act of betrayal, a whispered location, a familiar trail would soon bring the legend face to face with his final dawn. But in that dawn, even defeat would look like victory. Because some men are not meant to win battles. They are meant to awaken nations. It happened in October, 1956 inches, the deep silence of the Aberdare forest, where mist clung to every leaf like breath. Kimathi's army was fractured, his supplies thin, but his resolve unbroken. He had survived years of pursuit, escaped ambushes, and walked through bullets that seemed meant for others. But in the end, it wasn't a soldier who found him. It was betrayal. One of his comrades, captured and tortured, revealed his hiding place, a cave at the edge of the forest, near the village of Kahigaini. The British called it Operation Dwindle, as if naming his capture could shrink his legend. Before dawn, a squad of colonial police surrounded the thicket. They moved silently, guided by flashlights and the trembling hands of the informant. The forest held its breath. Inside the cave, Kimathi lay awake, his leg wrapped in a bandage from a recent skirmish. He clutched his Bible, listening to the faint echo of boots through the fog. He knew. He always knew. When the first shot rang out, he rose gun in hand, but a bullet tore through his thigh before he could fire. He fell, the leopard cloak slipping from his shoulders into the mud. Blood mixed with earth, the same earth he had sworn to defend. He looked up at the soldier who approached, a young Kikuyu man wearing a British uniform. For a moment, their eyes met, one filled with defiance, the other with shame. Kimathi whispered, "You cannot arrest a dream." He was carried out of the forest on a stretcher, barefoot, bleeding, but calm. Witnesses said he did not cry out once. He kept asking only one thing: "Are my people free?" The British officers paraded him before cameras, their faces proud as hunters returning with prey. But what they captured was not triumph, it was fear. Because when Kimathi looked into the lens, he did not look defeated. He looked eternal. In their reports, they wrote that the rebel leader was wounded and captured. But the forest told a different story, that it was not a man they took, but a spirit that refused to kneel. And even as he lay in a prison cell, leg infected, feverish, the sound of his name rolled through the valleys like thunder. Mothers whispered it to their sons. Children scratched it into the dirt. Farmers sang it in the fields. Kimathi had fallen, but Kenya had risen. In his final letter to his wife, smuggled from his cell, he wrote, "The body is weak, but the soul of this land cannot die. Tell them the forest is still awake." And somewhere beyond the prison walls, the forest indeed whispered back, not in words, but in wind. They called it a trial, but it was already a sentence. On the 19th of November, 1956, Dedan Kimathi was brought before the colonial court in Nyeri. The charge: possession of a firearm without a license. A small pistol, his last, became the empire's excuse for execution. He was too dangerous to live, too inspiring to let fade naturally. In the packed courtroom, Kimathi sat upright, wearing his torn leopard cloak over prison rags. His leg was bandaged, but his eyes, those sharp, unyielding eyes, met everyone who dared to look. The judge, a British man in a powdered wig, cleared his throat and asked, "Do you plead guilty?" Kimathi smiled faintly. "If freedom is guilt, I plead guilty to all of it." The courtroom fell silent. Even the interpreter hesitated to repeat the words. For days, witnesses testified, policemen, informants, colonial officers, all rehearsing the same story. Kimathi listened quietly, sometimes closing his eyes as if to pray, sometimes gazing beyond the window toward the mountains he once commanded. He was not thinking of his own fate. He was thinking of the children born in camps, of the mothers washing their dead in rivers, of the songs that would outlive the verdict. When the judge read the sentence, death by hanging, Kimathi stood slowly. He asked to speak. They allowed him one final statement. His voice was steady. "You may kill the body of one man, but not the spirit of a nation. Kenya will be free, whether I live or die." Even the clerk paused, his pen trembling above the paper. The words were transcribed, but their weight could not be measured in ink. Outside the courtroom, the crowd wept. Women tore pieces of their garments in mourning. A few men raised clenched fists before being pushed back by guards. They could not stop the execution, but they could witness it. On the 18th of February 1957, before sunrise, Kimathi was led from his cell at Kimathi prison. He refused a blindfold. He whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for Kenya. When the trapdoor opened, the empire thought it had silenced a rebellion, but they were wrong. The British buried him in secret, his grave unmarked, his body hidden. No one knew where. They thought anonymity would erase memory. Yet, the next morning, a guard claimed he heard something through the bars, the wind humming through the acacia trees, carrying 4 words, "Kenya shall be free." The empire wrote, "Case closed." But history had just begun to write his name, not in ink, but in blood, in soil, in song. They buried him in silence. No procession, no marker, no farewell. Just a shallow grave inside Kimathi prison, somewhere beneath the red soil of Nairobi, a secret swallowed by empire. The guards said the body was taken before dawn, covered in a rough blanket. No one was allowed to follow. No one was told where. But the British misunderstood something ancient, that when you bury a seed, you do not end it, you begin it. Within weeks of Kimathi's death, songs began to echo in the highlands. Soft at first, carried by farmers as they tilled fields once stolen, then louder sung in schools, whispered in camps, shouted in protests. His name became rhythm, his oath became prayer, and his absence became presence. In the detention camps, where over 1 million Kikuyu were still imprisoned, prisoners began to carve small wooden crosses and hide them under their mattresses. Each one bore the letters DK. To them, he was not gone, he was watching. The empire could hang a man, but it could not hang memory. By 1959, even British newspapers began to admit what had once been unthinkable. The Mau Mau emergency had changed the empire itself. It had shown that colonial rule was not eternal, it was borrowed time. Kimathi's blood had written the first line of a new script, one that would end with the word Uhuru, freedom. And when that word finally arrived in 1963, the world stood still. The British flag lowered over Nairobi. A new flag rose, black, red, green, the colors of soil, struggle, and hope. As the crowd cheered, an old man in the front row whispered to his grandson, "This is Kimathi's day." In the years that followed, Kenya began to rebuild. Roads replaced forests, cities grew, and generations born after the war spoke of Kimathi as a myth, half legend, half ghost. But in the countryside, elders still pointed to the hills of Aberdare and said, "That is where the forest spoke." Mukami Kimathi, his wife, never stopped searching for his grave. For decades, she visited Kimathi prison, asking guards, priests, and former officers to tell her where he lay. None could answer. Yet she said she could feel him in the wind. "He is not lost," she told a journalist once. "He went back to the land he fought for." In 2007, 50 years after his death, the government of Kenya finally erected his statue in the heart of Nairobi. Bronze, tall, unbowed, the leopard cloak draped over his shoulders, the rifle in his hand pointed to the sky. At its base are carved his last words, "You can kill me, but you cannot kill the dream of Kenya." On that day, the forest seemed to breathe again, and in the crowd, as drums echoed across the city, someone whispered, "The empire buried him, but the soil gave him back." History is cruel to those who dream too early. Dedan Kimathi did not live to see the dawn he created, but freedom, like the forest, grows best in the dark. He was not a general with medals, nor a king with wealth. He was a teacher who traded chalk for a rifle, and found truth not in books, but in sacrifice. To the British, he was an outlaw. To Kenya, he became a conscience. When nations are young, they need men who can dream beyond reason. Men who see liberation not as a negotiation, but as destiny. Kimathi was one of them. His life reminds us that freedom is never granted. It is taken, one act of courage at a time. Today, Nairobi hums with life's skyscrapers, cars, laughter, the pulse of a nation alive. Few who walk its streets know where Kimathi's unmarked graves lie. But somewhere under that soil, the bones of one man still whisper to the roots above, "Guard what we died for." The forest of Aberdare still stands, older now, quieter. Birds nest where rifles once hung, Rain falls on the same ground that once ran red, and when the wind passes through the leaves, it carries a sound that is neither sorrow nor triumph, but something in between. It sounds like breathing. It sounds like a promise kept. Kimathi's story is not only Kenya's. It is the story of every people who have ever looked upon injustice and said, "No more." It is a reminder that liberty does not grow from comfort, but from endurance, from those who choose dignity over life. He was hanged as a rebel, but history renamed him as Father. He died in chains, yet left behind a nation that walks free, and though time may blur his face, it will never silence his echo. Because every time a Kenyan child stands proud, every time a farmer tills his own soil, every time a nation remembers its roots, Dedan Kimathi stands again. In the end, his dream was simple, but eternal, that the land belongs to those who love it enough to bleed for it, and the forest still whispers his vow, not in fear, but in freedom.